The cattle cars rolled through the American countryside in autumn 1943, carrying their human cargo toward camps in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. Inside, pressed against wooden slats, German prisoners of war stared out at a landscape that made no sense. Fields stretched to the horizon, heavy with corn and wheat. Tractors moved through them, driven by farmers who weren't starving, weren't conscripted, weren't afraid. Towns passed by with lights blazing, no blackout curtains, no bombed-out buildings, no ruins. Children played in yards. Women hung laundry. Cars moved freely on roads that weren't cratered by bombs. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz von Guerra, who'd been shot down over England and transferred to Canada before escaping and being recaptured near the American border, later described the moment. "I thought it was propaganda. An elaborate stage set. It couldn't be real, no country at war looks like this. But it was real." And for hundreds of thousands of German POWs who would spend the war years imprisoned in the United States, this cognitive dissonance, the gap between what they'd been told about America and what they could see with their own eyes, would become the defining experience of their captivity. They'd been told America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. They'd been told the American people were suffering, that the war economy was failing, that invasion by Japan was imminent. They'd been told that Jewish conspiracies controlled everything, that racial mixing had destroyed social order, that democracy was chaos barely contained. And then they saw Iowa, Nebraska, California. They saw a country so wealthy, so productive, so utterly untouched by war that it seemed to exist in a different universe than the one they'd left behind. This is the story of what happened when the propaganda met reality, when ideology crashed into observation, when certainty confronted evidence, when men raised on lies had to decide what to believe when the truth was all around them. By 1945, the United States held over 425,000 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps scattered across the country. They were everywhere, picking cotton in Mississippi, harvesting sugar beets in Minnesota, cutting timber in Oregon, working on farms from Arizona to Maine. They lived in barracks behind barbed wire, guarded by American soldiers, but they could see beyond the fences. And what they saw changed many of them forever. The Geneva Convention required that POs be treated humanely, fed adequately, housed safely, and allowed to work for wages. The United States took these requirements seriously, partly out of genuine commitment to international law, partly because American POs in German camps would be treated according to how Germans were treated in American camps, partly because there was propaganda value in showing that democracy could be generous even to enemies. So German POs in America ate better than German civilians in Germany. They received medical care that was often superior to what they'd gotten in the Wehrmacht. They were paid for their labor, not much, but real money that they could spend in camp canteens or save. They had access to education, sports, entertainment, religious services. The contrast with what they'd left behind was staggering. Many had come from cities being bombed nightly by the Allies. They'd experienced rationing so severe that hunger was constant. They'd seen the war economy consuming everything: metals, fabrics, food, fuel, people. They'd watched Germany hollowing out, sacrificing civilian welfare for military production, spiraling into desperation. And then they arrived in a country where civilians were living better than they lived before the war, where production had increased, not decreased, where you could buy things, actual consumer goods, in stores that had inventory, where the lights stayed on, the water ran, the trains arrived on schedule. The initial reaction was usually denial. This had to be fake a Potemkin village on a continental scale, designed to demoralize prisoners. The Americans were showing them carefully selected areas, hiding the real suffering. Or this was a temporary abundance that would soon collapse, as it must, because no country could sustain this while fighting a global war. But the denial became harder to maintain as time passed. The prisoners weren't just seeing propaganda, they were living in American communities, working alongside American civilians, observing daily life up close. And the abundance wasn't temporary. It was everywhere, constant, real. Camp Aliceville in Alabama held over 6,000 German POWs who worked on local farms and in timber operations. They lived in barracks that were basic but clean, with running water and electricity. They ate 3 meals a day, not gourmet, but sufficient, and sometimes more than sufficient. Sunday meals sometimes included chicken or pork, vegetables, bread, dessert. One prisoner, writing secretly to his family letters that were intercepted and read by American censors, which is how we know about them, described a Sunday dinner in 1944. We had roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, bread with real butter, and apple pie. I have not eaten like this since before the war began. The guards eat the same food. This is not special treatment, this is normal for them. The realization in that last sentence is crucial. This is normal for them. The abundance wasn't a show. It was just American life during wartime, which was better than German life during peacetime. The work assignments exposed prisoners to even more. They were sent to farms throughout the Midwest and South to address labor shortages caused by Americans being drafted, or taking higher-paying factory jobs. Under guard, they'd ride trucks to farms where they'd spend days harvesting crops, living in temporary barracks, working alongside the farmer and whatever family or local help was available. And they'd see farmhouses with electricity, refrigerators, radios, cars in the driveway. They'd see farmers' wives who weren't starving, children who were healthy and well-fed, a prosperity that seemed impossible. They'd even told America was barely functioning here was a farmer who owned more machinery than a German factory, living better than a German industrialist. Some prisoners tried to rationalize this. The Americans must be taking everything from conquered peoples, but the prisoners had come through countries. America had liberated, not colonized, and those countries were receiving aid, not being plundered. Or maybe this was wealth built on Jewish control of finance. But that didn't explain the physical abundance, the production capacity, the infrastructure. Others simply couldn't process it and retreated into rigid ideology. These were the hardcore Nazis in the camps, and there were many of them. They maintained party discipline inside the wire, enforced loyalty to the Führer, punished prisoners who expressed doubt. They created internal Gestapos, held kangaroo courts, beat or killed prisoners who collaborated too enthusiastically with Americans or who spoke openly about what they were seeing. The Americans largely allowed this. They separated out the most fanatical Nazis when they could identify them. But maintaining order within the camps was often easier if they let the German command structure persist. This created a strange dynamic, prisoners living in American abundance while being policed by true believers who insisted that everything they were seeing was a lie. Camp Concordia in Kansas became notorious for this internal tension. It held over 4,000 prisoners, many of them Afrika Korps veterans who'd been captured in North Africa and transferred across the Atlantic. The camp had its own Nazi power structure, led by hardcore officers who enforced discipline with brutal efficiency. In 1943, a prisoner named Johannes Kahns was suspected of informing the Americans about internal camp activities. Other prisoners abducted him from his barracks in the middle of the night, beat him nearly to death, and hanged him in a shower room. The murder sent shockwaves through the POW system. American authorities investigated, identified the perpetrators, and prosecuted them. 5 German POWs were eventually hanged in 1945 for the murder executed not by Nazi Germany for treason, but by the United States for murder committed on American soil. The trial revealed the depth of ideological commitment among some prisoners. The defendants showed no remorse. They'd been enforcing military discipline, punishing a traitor, doing their duty. That they were prisoners of war in a foreign country, that the Third Reich had no authority here, that they'd murdered a man for the crime of talking to Americans, none of that mattered. They remained loyal to the end. But they were the minority, or at least became the minority as the war dragged on and reality became harder to deny. Most prisoners weren't fanatics. They were conscripts, ordinary soldiers who'd fought because that's what you did, who'd believed in victory because they had to believe in something. And for them, the experience of being a POW in America was profoundly destabilizing. The American guards were nothing like what they'd expected. The propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, cowardly troops that would break at the first real resistance. But the guards the prisoners encountered were professional, often combat veterans who'd fought in North Africa or Italy or France before rotating home. They were firm but generally fair, enforcing rules without cruelty. And they were racially integrated or becoming so as the war progressed. Black American soldiers served as guards at many camps, which was its own shock to German prisoners raised on Nazi racial theories. They'd been taught that black people were subhuman, that racial mixing destroyed civilizations, that America was collapsing under the weight of its diversity. But here were black guards with authority, discipline, education. And they weren't subservient. They were Americans, serving their country, doing their jobs with competence. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. Some prisoners doubled down on racism, treating black guards with particular contempt, which usually resulted in stricter discipline and more unpleasant work assignments. Others began to question what they'd been taught. One prisoner, in a letter home that American censors preserved, wrote, "Today I was guarded by a colored soldier who spoke better English than I speak German, who corrected my grammar when I asked him a question. I had been told these people could barely speak. I had been told many things that are not true. The towns near the camps were their own education." Prisoners on work details would pass through American communities, small towns, mostly farming communities, nothing exceptional. But they'd see churches, schools, shops, normalcy. They'd see people going about their lives without fear, without deprivation, without the constant tension that had defined life in wartime Germany. Some camps allowed limited interaction between prisoners and locals, usually supervised but occasionally surprisingly casual. Prisoners would work on a farm, and the farmer's wife would bring out lemonade and sandwiches at lunch. They'd eat together, talk through broken English and gestures, find common ground as farmers discussing crops and weather and the universal challenges of agriculture. These moments were small but corrosive to ideology. It's hard to maintain hatred for people who are feeding you, hard to believe in their inferiority when they're treating you with casual decency, hard to sustain propaganda when reality keeps contradicting it. The mail system created another crack in the ideological wall. Prisoners could write home, subject to censorship. They'd write to wives, mothers, siblings, trying to let them know they were alive and safe. And they'd try to describe where they were, what they were experiencing. But how do you explain to someone in bombed-out Hamburg that you're in Kansas eating roast chicken? How do you tell your mother, who's rationing every gram of flour, that you had apple pie for dessert? How do you describe America, this impossible, abundant, untouched by war America, to people suffering in ruins? Many didn't try. They wrote vague letters about being treated well, about being safe, about hoping to come home soon. They self-censored, not because of American censors, but because the truth was too vast and strange to fit in a letter, too likely to be dismissed as collaboration or propaganda. Others tried to be honest and were met with disbelief. Letters came back from Germany when they came at all, expressing confusion, suspicion, sometimes anger. "You've been brainwashed," family members wrote. "Don't trust what you see." The homeland couldn't accept that the prisoners' reality was real, because accepting it meant accepting that everything they'd been told about the war was a lie. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944 and 1945, the psychological pressure on prisoners intensified. News filtered into the camps not from German sources which had stopped being reliable, but from American newspapers and radio that the prisoners could access. They learned about D-Day, the liberation of France, the advance into Germany. They learned about the bombing campaigns, reducing German cities to rubble. And they worried about their families. Were their homes still standing? Were their wives and children alive? The uncertainty was torture, made worse by the fact that they were safe and well-fed while their loved ones were suffering. The guilt was enormous survivor's guilt mixed with shame at being captured, at sitting out the war's end in comfort while Germany burned. Some prisoners became depressed, withdrawn, angry at their own powerlessness. Others threw themselves into work, into education, into anything that would distract from thoughts of home. The camps offered classes, English language, mathematics, vocational training, and many prisoners attended obsessively, preparing for a future they couldn't quite imagine. The education program was partly humanitarian, partly strategic. American officials understood that these prisoners would eventually return to Germany and help rebuild it. Better that they return with skills, with some understanding of democratic values, with a more realistic view of the world than the propaganda they've been fed, so the camps became schools of a sort. Prisoners learned trades, carpentry, mechanics, agriculture. They read American literature in translation. They watched American films carefully selected, nothing too propagandistic, but films that showed American life, American values, American culture, and slowly, incrementally, some began to change. Not overnight conversions, ideology doesn't work that way, but a gradual erosion of certainty. A willingness to consider that maybe what they'd been taught was wrong. That maybe the Americans weren't the enemy propaganda had described. Camp Como in Mississippi developed an unexpected reputation for its education program. The camp commander, a lieutenant colonel who'd been a teacher before the war, believed in rehabilitation through education. He expanded the camp's library, brought in German-language books that weren't Nazi propaganda, organized lectures and discussions. The hardcore Nazis in the camp hated this. They saw it as collaboration, as American attempts at brainwashing. They harassed prisoners who attended the programs, vandalized the library, created an atmosphere of intimidation. But the commander persisted, and gradually the programs gained traction. Prisoners who'd been teachers or professors in civilian life began offering courses. Political discussions emerged, carefully moderated to avoid violence, but genuine debates about Germany's future, about what had gone wrong, about what would come next. These discussions were revolutionary. For years, these men had lived in a totalitarian society where questioning the regime meant imprisonment or death. Disagreement was treason. Independent thought was dangerous. And now they were in an environment where they could actually debate ideas, where disagreeing with someone didn't result in punishment, where thinking for yourself was encouraged. The experience was transformative for some. They discovered that democracy wasn't chaos, it was people working through disagreement without violence. They learned that diversity of opinion could strengthen rather than weaken a society. They began to understand that the propaganda had inverted reality, calling strength weakness and weakness strength, calling oppression order and freedom chaos. Not everyone changed. Some remained committed Nazis to the end and beyond. When the war ended and prisoners learned about Germany's unconditional surrender, about the full extent of the defeat, some refused to believe it. They insisted it was American propaganda, that Germany was regrouping, that secret weapons would still turn the tide. When they learned about the concentration camps, about the industrial murder of millions, about the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done, many refused to believe that too. It was too enormous, too monstrous. Surely this was a lied propaganda, atrocities invented to justify the war. No civilized nation could do such things. American authorities brought German POWs to see the evidence. They showed them photographs, newsreels, documentation of the camps. They brought some prisoners to Europe on work details that took them near liberated concentration camps. Let them see the evidence firsthand. Some prisoners confronted with this evidence experienced genuine psychological breaks. Their entire worldview, everything they'd believed about Germany, about the Nazi Party, about the righteousness of their cause shattered in moments. They'd fought for monsters. They'd given years of their lives to evil. Nothing could justify that, nothing could redeem it. Others rationalized. They hadn't known. These were aberrations, not official policy. Everyone commits atrocities in war. This was just the losing side being held accountable. The Americans were exaggerating, using isolated incidents to condemn an entire regime. Anything to avoid confronting the full reality of what they'd been part of. The question of complicity haunted those who were willing to confront it. What responsibility did ordinary soldiers bear for the crimes of their government? They'd just been following orders, doing their duty, fighting for their country. But their fighting had enabled the regime. Their obedience had empowered it. The line between innocent soldier and guilty participant was blurrier than they wanted to admit. Living in America complicated this reckoning. The prisoners could see what a country looked like when it was organized around conquest and racial ideology. They could see civic institutions functioning, rule of law operating, diversity coexisting. They could see what Germany might have been, what it had sacrificed in pursuit of Nazi fantasies. Some prisoners developed genuine affection for America during their captivity. They made friends with guards, with farmers they worked for, with locals in nearby towns. They experienced kindness from people who had every reason to hate them. They were treated as human beings rather than enemies, given chances to prove themselves, offered opportunities for redemption. One prisoner, working on a farm in Iowa, developed a close relationship with the farmer who employed him. The farmer's son had died at Normandy, killed by German artillery. The prisoner expected hatred. Instead, he found a man dealing with grief through grace, who treated his enemy soldier as a fellow human being. When the war ended, the prisoner asked why the farmer didn't hate him. The farmer said, "You didn't kill my son. The war killed my son. Hating you won't bring him back. But maybe treating you decent will help make sure we don't have another war." It was a profoundly American response, pragmatic, forward-looking, humane. And for the prisoner, who'd been raised in a culture of grudges and revenge and eternal conflict, it was a revelation. You could choose not to hate. You could choose to build rather than destroy. You could choose a different future. The repatriation process began in 1945 and stretched into 1946. Prisoners were shipped back to Europe in waves. The same cattle cars in reverse, the same ocean crossings. But they were returning to a very different Germany than the one they'd left. Germany was in ruins, cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, millions dead or displaced, the economy shattered, the country divided and occupied. The prisoners returned to devastation, to a homeland that barely existed anymore. And they returned changed. Not all of them. Some came back as committed Nazis as when they'd left, bitter about the defeat, nursing grievances, ready to blame everyone but themselves. But many had been transformed by their time in America, by the cognitive dissonance of living in abundance while their country suffered, by the slow erosion of ideology in the face of reality. These men became part of Germany's reconstruction, carrying with them lessons learned in POW camps in Kansas and Mississippi and Oregon. Some became businessmen, bringing American ideas about productivity and management. Others became teachers, spreading democratic values they'd learned while imprisoned. Some entered politics, helping build the new federal republic on principles they'd observed working in practice. Fritz Kremer, a prisoner who'd spent 2 years in a Texas camp, later wrote, "I learned more about democracy in that camp than I ever would have in Germany. I saw it functioning not perfectly, but functioning. I saw people disagreeing without killing each other. I saw diversity as strength rather than weakness. I saw that the propaganda had been lies, all of it, and that the truth was better than the lies ever were." The POW camps are mostly gone now. Some were demolished immediately after the war. Others were converted to other uses: military installations, industrial sites, parks. A few remain as historical markers, small plaques noting that German prisoners once lived here, worked here, learned here. In Concordia, Kansas, there's a small museum dedicated to Camp Concordia. It preserves artifacts from the camp letters, photographs, personal items left behind. Tour guides tell the story of the prisoners who lived there, the murder of Johannes Kunz, the gradual transformation of men from enemies to something more complicated. Local old-timers sometimes remember the prisoners. They were children when the Germans were here, but they remember seeing the work. Details remember their parents. Talking about the strange situation of enemy soldiers working on local farms remember the weird normalcy of war, happening somewhere else while Kansas remained untouched. In Mississippi, descendants of prisoners occasionally visit the sites where their fathers or grandfathers were held. They come seeking connection to a past that's hard to imagine, trying to understand what it was like for their ancestors to be so far from home, to see a country so different from everything they'd known. These visits are usually quiet, private affairs. But occasionally there are public reconciliations. German veterans returning to meet American veterans, prisoners reconnecting with guards or farmers they'd worked for, formal ceremonies acknowledging the complex history. In 1976, a group of former German POWs returned to a farm in Iowa where they de-worked during the war. The farmer who'd employed them had died, but his widow was still alive. They came to thank her for treating them humanely, for feeding them, for seeing them as people rather than enemies. She was gracious but matter-of-fact. "You were boys far from home. War wasn't your fault. Least I could do was treat you decent." It was the American pragmatism that had so confused them during their captivity, the refusal to nurse grudges, the willingness to move forward, the basic decency that transcended ideology. The historical legacy of the German POW experience in America is complicated. It's a footnote to the larger war, a strange interlude that most Americans don't know about and most Germans don't discuss. But it reveals something important about both countries, about American capacity for generosity even toward enemies, and about the power of reality to overcome propaganda when people are forced to confront it directly. The prisoners who were most transformed by the experience often struggled to articulate what had changed. It wasn't that they'd been converted to American ideology. Many remained critical of aspects of American culture, uncomfortable with its commercialism and informality and chaos. But they'd seen that a different way of organizing society was possible, that democracy could work, that prosperity didn't require conquest. This knowledge became part of post-war Germany's foundation. The federal republic that emerged from the ruins was consciously built on democratic principles, many of which were modeled on American examples. Former POWs who'd seen democracy functioning in America became its advocates in Germany, helping to create institutions that would prevent another descent into totalitarianism. The irony is profound. German soldiers captured fighting against democracy, learned democratic values while imprisoned, and brought them home to help rebuild their country on democratic foundations. The war's greatest enemy became one of its most important teachers. But the transformation wasn't universal, and the lessons weren't always learned. Some former POWs returned to Germany nursing grievances, bitter about the defeat, convinced that Germany had been betrayed rather than beaten. They joined extremist groups, spread conspiracy theories, refused to accept responsibility for what Germany had done. The split between prisoners who changed and those who didn't reflected a larger split in post-war Germany, between those willing to confront the past and those who preferred comfortable lies, between those who embraced democracy and those who mourned dictatorship, between forward-looking and backward-looking visions of the future. The camps themselves, in their brief existence, became microcosms of this larger struggle. Inside the wire, debates raged about what Germany had been, what it had become, what it should be next. Hardcore Nazis fought to maintain ideological purity. Doubters questioned everything they'd been taught. Pragmatists just wanted to survive and go home. And above it all, America, abundant, confident, untouched by the war that had devastated Europe, offered a glimpse of a different possibility. Not perfect, not without problems, but functioning in ways that made the Nazi promises of order and strength look hollow. For men raised to believe that democracy was weak, that diversity was destructive, that only totalitarian discipline could create a functioning society, the evidence of their own eyes was devastating. America shouldn't work according to the theories they'd been taught. But it did work. It worked spectacularly well, at least in comparison to the smoking ruins they'd left behind. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between ideology and observation, became the defining experience of German POWs in America. Some resolved it by changing their beliefs. Others resolved it by denying their observations. Most lived somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, unable to fully embrace either the propaganda or the reality, caught between what they'd been taught and what they could see. When they returned to Germany and began rebuilding, this tension traveled with them. The Germany they helped create, the Federal Republic, democratic and prosperous and integrated into the Western Alliance, reflected the lessons some had learned. But the extremism that periodically resurfaces in German politics reflects the lessons others refused to learn. The ideology that couldn't be killed even by overwhelming evidence of its failure. The story of German POWs, confused by American abundance, is ultimately a story about the power and limits of propaganda. It can shape minds profoundly, can create belief systems resistant to facts, can sustain themselves even in the face of contradictory evidence. But it can't survive indefinite exposure to reality. Eventually, for at least some people, observation overcomes indoctrination. The men who lived in POW camps in America, who worked on farms in the Midwest and forests in the South, who ate better as prisoners than they had as free men, who saw a country at war living in peace, they confronted a reality that propaganda couldn't explain. And while many clung to ideology anyway, enough didn't that it mattered. They returned to Germany carrying knowledge that could be unlearned, that the enemy they'd fought was more decent than they'd been told, that the system they'd served was more monstrous than they'd known, that a different kind of society was possible if you were willing to build it. The camps are gone. The prisoners are nearly all dead now, even the youngest would be in their 90s. The physical evidence of this strange chapter is fading, preserved in small museums and historical markers that most people drive past without noticing. But the legacy remains in the Germany that emerged from the war, democratic, prosperous, integrated into Europe, a far cry from the totalitarian nightmare that had consumed it. The POWs who came home changed, who brought with them lessons learned behind barbed wire in Kansas and Mississippi, helped build that new Germany. They'd been confused when they saw civilians living in peace while at war. That confusion was the beginning of wisdom, the recognition that what they'd been taught was wrong. That reality was more complex and more hopeful than propaganda allowed. In the end, the greatest weapon against totalitarian ideology wasn't bombs or bullets. It was the simple, undeniable evidence of people living freely, decently, prosperously. The prisoners saw it, and some couldn't unsee it. They carried that vision home and used it to build something better from the ruins. The cattle cars that carried them back to Europe carried more than men. They carried hope, battered, uncertain, but real, that the future didn't have to be like the past. That the cycle of hatred and war and destruction could be broken. That people who'd been enemies could become something else. It was a fragile hope, and history shows how often it's been disappointed. But sometimes in the gap between propaganda and reality, in the confusion of soldiers confronting evidence that contradicts everything they've been taught, transformation becomes possible. The German POWs who lived in America during World War II experienced that transformation. Not all of them, not permanently, not completely. But enough that when they went home and started rebuilding, they built something different, something that, however imperfectly, proved that the propaganda had been wrong, and the reality they de-glimpsed behind barbed wire in Iowa had been true. The camps are empty now. But what happened inside them echoes still, in the Germany that exists today, in the lessons learned about the power of decency over ideology, about the possibility of change even in the most unlikely circumstances. They were confused when they saw peace during war. That confusion saved some of them. And through them, it helped save Germany too.